Before we begin, pause for a moment and notice where you are and when you are hearing these words, because this story did not survive by accident. It resurfaced the way dangerous truths often do, quietly, through gaps in the record that were never meant to be examined too closely. The first thing that survived was not a confession, not a witness, not a story anyone meant to tell out loud. It was a book, heavy, leather-bound. The kind of volume that records ordinary things in extraordinary ink because the people writing in it believe paper makes reality obedient. It lay for decades in a public building where damp stone sweats through summer and winter alike, shelved among tax rolls and probate packets and folded petitions that smell faintly of iron and mildew. No one opened it because no one needed it for daily business. It belonged to the category of records that exist to be possessed, not read, like a sealed jar in a cellar that everyone steps around without asking what's inside. When it was finally handled again, it was not by someone chasing scandal. It was by a person paid to reorder boxes, to make sense of a basement that had become a graveyard of paperwork. The spine cracked with the sound of old glue failing. Pages lifted, stiff at the edges, and then the anomaly appeared with the calmness of an accounting entry. A sequence of births written in a careful hand that did not match the rest of the county's language. The dates fit the calendar, the ink fit the era, the form fit the practice, but the content refused to fit the world that claimed to contain it. Multiple children recorded within a narrow span, multiple mothers recorded as separate individuals, yet linked with a notation that should not have existed in any formal registry. A physical mark described with such consistency, such precision, that it read less like a midwife's casual note and more like a breeder's identifier. The clerk who found it assumed at first that it was a private ledger, mislaid among public records, the way family papers sometimes drift into courthouse storage after an estate sale. That assumption is how most buried things remain buried. People label what they cannot explain as mundane, and the mundane label becomes a second lock on the door. What she did not notice, not then, was the way the entries were spaced, the way the ink pressure changed on certain words, and the way the last page in that series carried a different hand entirely, hesitant and uneven, as if whoever wrote it had been forced to write under a weight that made the wrist unreliable. The phrase on that last page was not legal, it was moral. A request for forgiveness without a clear confession, which is often the most revealing kind. That single line did not explain anything, but it did what the best evidence does. It changed the air around everything that came before it. Because once you see a plea for forgiveness in a book that pretends to be neutral, you have to ask what kind of act was important enough to break the pose of record-keeping. The story that follows begins in a year when women could be surrounded by wealth and still be functionally temporary, when property could pass through their hands without ever belonging to them, and when the law treated their authority as a loan that would be recalled the moment a man arrived to claim it. It begins with a death that creates an administrative crisis disguised as grief. A husband dies unexpectedly, not in a heroic way, not in a way the family can shape into legend. A fall, a sudden, meaningless impact. The estate remains, the acreage remains, the workforce remains, and the accounts remain. But the legal architecture that controls it shifts immediately, like a house settling after a beam is removed. The widow, middle-aged, competent, and accustomed to managing domestic power inside boundaries she did not design, finds herself facing a problem that polite society solves with weddings. That is what the culture expects. Arrange marriages, attach daughters to men, transfer responsibility, protect reputation, and become background. But she does not move toward weddings. She moves toward paper. She spends her days in a locked room with ledgers and journals and notes that were never meant to be sentimental. The documents are about output, yield, production, improvement, and selection. Not only crops, livestock, lineage charts for animals, measured traits, recorded outcomes, and a language that treats life as a set of variables to be optimized. In those pages, she finds a method that her world already accepts: so long as it is applied to the correct subjects. She does not invent logic. The logic is already in the house, already respected, and already rewarded. She simply turns it toward a target the culture claims is sacred, even as it routinely violates it. Her daughters are of marrying age, and their value, in that society, is presented as refinement and bloodline, and the ability to produce legitimate heirs who can hold land without dispute. Yet, legitimacy is a fragile thing. It can be protected, fabricated, or destroyed, depending on who controls the story. The widow understands that without an heir produced on terms she can control, she will be replaced, either by husbands who will treat her as a temporary inconvenience, or by male relatives who will arrive with documents and take what they believe is theirs. Power, when it is on a timer, does not always become graceful. Sometimes it becomes inventive. Sometimes it becomes desperate. Sometimes it becomes clinical. She looks at the pool of eligible men available to her family and sees risk, poor matches, weak alliances, predators who will treat the estate as a prize and her daughters as a doorway to it. She looks at her daughters and sees not individuals with futures, but nodes in a system she is trying to keep intact. And then she looks beyond the family, beyond the parlor conversations and the formal calls, to someone on the property whose body has been evaluated for years in quiet, practical language. A tall worker with a skilled trade, unusually controlled, unusually intelligent, marked by a distinctive physical trait that could function, in her mind, as proof of lineage across future generations. She does not think of him as a person first. She thinks of him as a solution. That is the first true horror in this story, and it is important to name it clearly. The violence does not begin with a scream. It begins with a decision made in silence, a decision to treat another human being as breeding stock, to treat consent as a technicality, to treat desire as irrelevant, and to treat the law's classification of a person as permission to do what would otherwise be unthinkable. When she summons him into the private interior of the house, she does not speak like someone committing a crime. She speaks like someone negotiating a contract. She offers promises, documentation, future land, freedom at a later date, benefits that sound like mercy if you do not examine the structure that makes them necessary. The structure is the coercion. When refusal means punishment and acceptance means a distant chance at survival, the choice is not a choice. It is a trap shaped like opportunity. And he understands that immediately, even if he cannot say it. He has lived his entire life in a world where the powerful rarely need to threaten directly because the system threatens them. He asks for time. Time is granted in a way that feels generous, but generosity in this context is a tool. While he thinks, preparations begin. A secluded building is improved. Privacy is manufactured. The stage is built before the actors have agreed to the play. That detail matters because it tells you the outcome was assumed. It tells you the offer was never truly conditional. It was a script being put into motion, and the only variable left was how much resistance would need to be managed. When the daughters are brought into the plan, they are not offered the truth as equals. They are given an argument, a lecture made of finances, law, inheritance, vulnerabilities, and a moral reframing that uses necessity as cover. They are told this is the only way to keep what they have. They are told their futures depend on a secret that will bind them to their mother more tightly than any marriage ever could. Some resist at first, some ask the obvious questions. But the pressure is designed to be cumulative. The days pass, the options narrow. The fear of losing everything becomes louder than the fear of what they are being asked to do. Consent under that kind of pressure is a performance, not a free decision. And when they finally agree, what follows is not chaos. It is scheduled, ordered, rotational. A pattern of visits to the secluded building in a sequence that mirrors birth order, as if even violation must be kept tidy to feel acceptable. Months later, the births begin. And the same mark appears again and again, recorded with the calm precision of someone trying to convince themselves it is just biology, just chance, just an inheritance trait, not the visible signature of a scheme that required everyone involved to be complicit. By the time the sixth child is recorded, the secret has already changed the household. You can see it in the way silence becomes routine, in the way the women begin to fracture into separate coping mechanisms, and in the way the man who was promised a future starts to realize that promises in ink are still controlled by the hand that holds the pen. And if you think the most dangerous part of this story is what was done to create those children, you have not yet reached the point where containment begins. Because containment is where systems show you what they are willing to do to protect themselves. By the time the first generation of children reached walking age, the system had already begun to harden. What started as an improvised solution to a looming loss of control was becoming something formal without ever being written down as such. The widow did not announce rules. She did not need to. The rules emerged the way weather patterns do, through repetition and consequence. Access to the secluded building was limited. Movement was tracked not with chains, but with schedules. The man at the center of the arrangement was granted comforts that looked like privilege when viewed from a distance and like containment when examined closely. Better food, lighter work, privacy that was not privacy so much as isolation dressed up as consideration. He was no longer part of the broader community on the property. He existed in a narrowed corridor of purpose. This narrowing is important because it is how institutions disguise control as specialization. Once a person's role is defined narrowly enough, their disappearance from everything else feels logical rather than alarming. The daughters were instructed in silence with the same care they had been instructed in manners. Certain rooms were no longer discussed. Certain times of day were treated as unavailable without explanation. The children, as they grew, learned the rhythms without ever being told the reason for them. They absorbed secrecy the way other children absorb prayer, by watching adults behave as if something is sacred and dangerous at the same time. Outsiders noticed nothing at first. That is the advantage of operating inside norms that already expect women to be quiet, workers to be invisible, and families to present a unified face regardless of what is happening behind closed doors. The births were recorded properly. Baptisms were public. Godparents were chosen strategically. The paper trail was immaculate, which is how many crimes of this kind survive for so long. Clean records create the illusion of legitimacy, and legitimacy discourages curiosity. What changed was not the documents. It was the psychology of the household. The daughters did not become closer through shared burden. They became more separate. Each carried her part of the secret differently. One turned inward, refusing intimacy of any kind and developing a physical fragility that family members would later call constitutional weakness. Another embraced religious devotion with a severity that alarmed local clergy. A third hardened into a managerial presence, efficient and distant, adopting the language of her mother, almost without noticing. These were not random outcomes. They were adaptations to a reality that demanded emotional contortions to survive. And survival, in this context, did not mean freedom. It meant continuation. The widow watched these changes with a kind of grim satisfaction. To her, distress was evidence of seriousness. The arrangement was not supposed to feel easy. Ease would have meant frivolity, and frivolity would have endangered everything. She began to speak, in private notes, about stewardship, not of souls, but of outcomes. She wrote about the children's features as if they were yields, noting which traits appeared strongest, which combinations seemed most successful, and which daughter produced the healthiest infant. The language was careful, almost clinical, and it revealed something essential. She had crossed a boundary not just legally or morally, but cognitively. She was no longer thinking in terms of people. She was thinking in terms of inputs and results. That cognitive shift is what allowed the next phase to occur. Because once you believe you are managing a system rather than violating a trust, expansion begins to look like responsibility. Neighboring families began to notice the children, not consciously at first. It appeared as admiration, compliments offered too often, questions asked, and then quickly withdrawn, a sense that something about the household was unusually successful. In a culture obsessed with inheritance and continuity, success attracts attention the way blood attracts insects. The widow did not advertise what she had done, but she did not conceal the results either. She allowed them to be seen, knowing that envy would do some of the work for her. The first inquiry came disguised as concern. A friend, herself recently widowed, commented on the difficulty of securing her daughter's futures without strong alliances. The widow listened without interruption. When the moment came, she did not offer advice. She offered an example, carefully framed. Hypothetical, she spoke of unconventional solutions, of the difference between morality as performance and morality as protection, of the danger of allowing rigid rules to destroy what those rules claim to preserve. The conversation did not end with an agreement. It did not need to. The seed had been planted, and the soil was already prepared by fear. Within a year, another household adopted a version of the arrangement. Not identical. They made changes, different schedules, different justifications. But the core logic remained the same. Use what the law classifies as property to secure what the law protects as legacy. The expansion introduced risk. More participants meant more chances for fracture. The widow responded the way any system builder does when faced with scale. She tightened control. Information was compartmentalized. Each household was encouraged to believe its version was unique, necessary, and isolated. The man at the center of the original arrangement was no longer just a solution. He was a liability. His knowledge extended across households now. His existence connected secrets that needed to remain separate. The widow adjusted her promises accordingly. Freedom was delayed, then redefined, then spoken of less often. The documents she had prepared were revised, clauses added. Conditions were inserted that required compliance to be demonstrated continuously. This is another familiar institutional move. Rewards are transformed into behaviors, and behaviors are then monitored indefinitely. The man noticed the shift. He had not believed the promises fully to begin with, but he had believed in time, in the idea that duration itself would eventually produce leverage. What he learned instead was that time was being used against him. The longer the arrangement lasted, the more indispensable his silence became, and the more dangerous any attempt to disrupt it would be. He began to understand that the system did not require his consent anymore because it had already absorbed him. The children he fathered were growing. They recognized him without understanding why. They were drawn to him with a familiarity that adults redirected quickly, gently, with practiced ease. Those moments were the most dangerous of all. Because recognition is harder to erase than evidence, it lives in the body, in posture, in voice, in the unspoken sense of resemblance that cannot be argued away once it has been felt. The widow saw this too. Her solution was not cruelty in the obvious sense. It was distance. The man's work was altered, less visible, more contained. His movements were restricted under the guise of protecting him from gossip, from accusation, and from the instability of a world that would punish him far more harshly than it would ever punish her. The logic was flawless if you accepted its premises. And by this point, everyone involved had accepted them, if only to survive the consequences of rejecting them. The system now extended beyond one household. It was no longer a secret. It was a network of silences, each reinforcing the other. And networks, once established, begin to behave in predictable ways. They protect themselves. They identify threats. They adapt. The widow had designed a bloodline, yes, but what she had really built was an architecture of containment. And architectures, once built, tend to outlive their architects. By the third decade, the original justification no longer held the same urgency, but the structure it created had taken on a life of its own. This is the stage most people misunderstand when they imagine secrets like this collapsing under their own weight. They assume exhaustion leads to confession, that guilt accumulates until it spills. What actually happens, more often, is normalization. Once a violation becomes routine, it stops feeling like an emergency and starts feeling like infrastructure. People arrange their lives around it. They teach their children how to step over it without seeing it. They design language to refer to it obliquely, a vocabulary of glances and pauses that communicates more than direct speech ever could. The widow was aging now. Her authority, once absolute within the household, was beginning to soften at the edges. That did not make her dangerous. It made her cautious. She understood that systems are most vulnerable during transitions, when control shifts hands without clarity. She began preparing her replacement, not by appointing a single successor, but by dispersing responsibility across those who had the most to lose if the truth emerged. This is a classic containment maneuver. When everyone is partially responsible, no one can safely defect. She rewrote documents to make them appear older than they were. She misfiled records so they would be harder to reconstruct later. She taught her daughters which details mattered and which could be sacrificed if someone ever came asking questions. Not all secrets need to be defended equally. Some can be allowed to fray if it protects the core. And the core, in this case, was legitimacy. As long as the children were accepted without question, everything else could be explained away as eccentricity, illness, misfortune, or rumor. The man whose body had made all of this possible was still alive, still necessary, and increasingly silent. Not because he had accepted his role, but because he had learned the cost of being heard. Early attempts to assert boundaries had been met with subtle punishment. Access restricted, food altered, privileges revoked without explanation. The message was never stated directly, but it was unmistakable. Stability was conditional. Compliance was rewarded. He adjusted accordingly. Silence became not just enforced, but strategic. He began to observe rather than react, to store knowledge rather than express it. People underestimate how much awareness can exist in a position of apparent powerlessness. He saw the cracks forming before anyone else did. He noticed which children asked questions and which avoided them. He noticed which households handled the secret with confidence and which trembled at the edges. He noticed how often the widow revised her notes, crossing out phrases that acknowledged personhood and replacing them with terms that suggested process. Those revisions were not about accuracy. They were about emotional insulation. Language is often the first thing people adjust when they need to continue doing something they know they should not be doing. Outside the network, the world was changing in ways that made secrecy both easier and harder. Easier because distance was increasing. Families traveled more. Properties changed hands. New people arrived who did not know what to look for. Harder because record-keeping was improving. The state was becoming more interested in documentation and more invested in consistency. Births, marriages, and property transfers were increasingly standardized. The kind of flexibility that had allowed the original arrangement to exist quietly was narrowing. The widow understood this too. She responded by accelerating certain timelines. Children were married earlier. Alliances were secured quickly. Anything that could anchor legitimacy before scrutiny intensified was prioritized. This had consequences. Some of the children struggled in their marriages. Some produced offspring too quickly, their bodies stressed by expectations they did not fully understand. The pressure to continue the line without interruption became its own form of violence, extending the original violation across generations in subtler ways. The daughters, now mothers themselves, faced a paradox they had not anticipated. They were being asked to enforce on their children the same silence that had shaped them, but without the justification of necessity. The original crisis was gone. The estate was stable. The immediate threat of dispossession had passed. And yet the secret remained. Not because it was still needed, but because it could no longer be removed without collapse. This is how systems of harm perpetuate themselves long after their origin story expires. They persist not because they are useful, but because they are embedded. One of the daughters began to resist quietly. Not openly, not dramatically. She simply refused to repeat certain phrases. She stopped correcting her children when they asked questions that brushed against the truth. She allowed moments of recognition to linger longer than was safe. This was not rebellion in the romantic sense. It was erosion, the kind that happens when someone is too tired to maintain the facade with the required precision. The widow noticed immediately. Erosion is visible to architects long before it becomes obvious to inhabitants. She intervened not with punishment, but with narrative. She reframed the past in ways that made deviation feel dangerous. She reminded her daughter of what would happen if the secret emerged. Not abstract consequences, but specific ones. Loss of standing, loss of protection, exposure to a legal system that would not treat ambiguity kindly. Fear is most effective when it feels personalized. The daughter complied, but something had shifted. Compliance now required effort. It was no longer automatic. And effort creates friction. Friction generates heat. Heat attracts attention. The first real threat came from outside the network, as it always does. A new official arrived, tasked with reorganizing regional records according to updated standards. He was not hunting secrets. He was hunting inconsistencies. That is often enough. He noticed patterns that did not match expectations. He noticed how often certain households appeared connected in ways the paperwork did not fully explain. He asked questions. Polite ones, technical ones, the kind that sound harmless until you realize they are probing structure, not story. The widow responded with practiced ease. She produced documents. She invoked reputation. She framed irregularities as clerical errors accumulated over decades. She used the weight of her standing to discourage deeper inquiry. And it worked, for the moment. But the encounter left her shaken in a way she did not show, because she understood something crucial. The world was no longer organized to protect secrets like hers indefinitely. The margin for error was shrinking, and when margins shrink, systems either collapse or become more ruthless. The widow chose the latter. She began planning for a future where the man at the center of the arrangement would no longer be alive, not out of cruelty alone, but out of risk management. As long as he existed, the possibility of exposure existed. She did not frame this as murder. She framed it as inevitability. Age, illness, natural causes. But inevitability can be guided. Conditions can be arranged. Care can be withheld just enough to let the body fail without leaving obvious marks. This is another truth people avoid. The most effective violence is often administered through neglect calibrated to look like fate. The preparations were subtle. Changes in diet, reduced access to medical attention, increased isolation justified as protection. The daughters were told this was necessary. Some believed it, some pretended to. All participated because by this point, participation was not a choice. It was the price of continuity. The system was preparing to remove its most vulnerable node, and with that preparation came a strange calm, the kind that precedes irreversible acts. The removal did not happen quickly. That would have required intention too visible to be shared comfortably. Instead, it unfolded as a narrowing of circumstances, a series of small adjustments that could each be justified on their own. The man was moved again, farther from the center of the property, into a structure described as temporary but treated as permanent. The move was explained as a precaution, a way to reduce speculation, and a kindness meant to shield him from curiosity he had not invited. What it actually did was sever the last informal lines of contact he had with the household. Children no longer wandered near his work. Meals were delivered by intermediaries. Conversations became transactional, limited to instructions and compliance checks. Silence, once strategic, was now enforced through distance. The widow monitored this phase closely. She visited rarely, and when she did, she spoke in a tone that suggested finality disguised as concern. She asked about his health without waiting for answers. She reminded him of promises in a way that made clear they were no longer negotiable. Freedom was still mentioned, but only as a theoretical endpoint that receded with every practical condition attached to it. He understood what was happening. Understanding did not grant him power, but it did grant him clarity. He began to mark time differently, not by seasons or tasks, but by the realization that his continued existence had shifted from being essential to being inconvenient. That shift is the most dangerous moment in any system built on exploitation. When a person transitions from asset to liability, the rules change. Care becomes minimal, risk tolerance drops. The margin for compassion disappears. The daughters sensed this too, though few could articulate it. They noticed the way their mother spoke about him in the past tense while he was still alive. They noticed how quickly concerns about his well-being were redirected into conversations about propriety and stability. One of them attempted to intervene, framing her concern in acceptable language. She suggested that neglect might provoke gossip if the man were to fall visibly ill. The widow responded with a lesson rather than an argument. Gossip, she explained, requires witnesses. Illness can be managed privately. Death, when it comes quietly, creates fewer questions than survival does. The daughter did not press further. This was not cowardice, it was recognition. Recognition that the system they were all trapped in now demanded a sacrifice that no one wanted to name. The man's health declined, predictably, not dramatically. There were no fevers that would draw attention, no injuries that would invite inquiry. Just a gradual weakening, weight loss, tremors, periods of confusion that were noted and then dismissed. Medical care was provided sporadically, enough to maintain plausible deniability, not enough to restore strength. When a physician was finally summoned, he was chosen carefully, a man known for discretion, a man who asked few questions and wrote even fewer notes. The diagnosis was vague: exhaustion, age, constitutional weakness. These were common enough to end the conversation. The widow ensured payment was generous. Generosity is often how silence is purchased in advance. During this period, the children of the arrangement were reaching adulthood. They were stepping into roles of authority themselves, inheriting responsibilities without fully understanding the foundation beneath them. Some sensed the truth. They felt it in the way their mothers flinched at certain questions, in the way family stories avoided particular years, and in the way their own features were remarked upon and then quickly forgotten. But sensing is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as acting. The structure around them provided every incentive to remain incurious. They had property, prospects, futures mapped out for them with a certainty denied to most. Questioning the past would not improve those futures. It would only destabilize them. The widow understood this perfectly. She had not only designed a bloodline, she had designed a psychology that would protect it. When the man finally died, it was recorded as an expected event, a natural conclusion to a long life of labor. No announcement was made beyond what was required. No gathering marked his passing. His body was disposed of efficiently, in a manner consistent with his legal status. The daughters were instructed not to dwell on it. Dwelling invites memory. Memory invites questions. Questions invite collapse. Some of them mourned privately. Others felt relief they could not admit, even to themselves. Relief that the most volatile element of the secret was gone. Relief that the risk had been reduced. That relief, too, was a cost of the system, because it required them to accept that safety had been purchased with a human life. The widow did not attend the burial. She had already moved on to the next phase: preservation. She gathered documents. Some were destroyed. Some were altered. Some were hidden in places where future discovery would require intent rather than accident. She understood archives the way strategists understand terrain. Not all information needs to disappear. Some information is more powerful when it exists, but cannot be easily accessed. She left enough fragments to maintain internal consistency and eliminated enough to prevent reconstruction. This balance is what separates effective concealment from panic-driven erasure. Panic leaves patterns. Calm concealment leaves no noise. Years passed. The widow aged visibly now. Her authority softened, not because it was challenged, but because it had achieved its goal. The bloodline was secure. The children were established. The system could now run without her direct supervision. She died without confessing anything. Her death was orderly, her estate settled according to plan. The daughters inherited not just property, but a burden that none of them had chosen, and all of them were now responsible for maintaining. The secret did not die with her. It became diffuse. Embedded in habits, silences, and inherited instructions that were passed down without explanation. This diffusion is what allowed it to survive beyond the generation that created it. Because when a secret belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one in particular. Accountability dissolves. Responsibility becomes abstract, and abstraction is the safest place for guilt to hide. The aftermath did not announce itself as a consequence. It rarely does. Instead, it arrived as continuity. Life on the estate resumed with an efficiency that would have appeared reassuring to anyone not attuned to what had been removed. Harvests proceeded, accounts balanced, marriages were arranged, children were born into circumstances so carefully prepared that deviation felt unthinkable. The system had worked, and systems that work are rarely interrogated by those who benefit from them. The daughters assumed their roles with varying degrees of comfort. Some embraced authority as inheritance, stepping into it as if it had always belonged to them. Others carried a quiet resistance that expressed itself only in private habits. Small mercies granted where none were required, and conversations cut short before they turned dangerous. None spoke openly. Silence had become a form of loyalty, and loyalty was rewarded. Outsiders noticed little. That was by design. The widow's greatest achievement was not the arrangement itself, but the normalization of its outcome. By the time questions might have been asked, the answers had been absorbed into routine. Records matched expectations. Relationships appeared conventional. The absence at the center of it all was no longer visible as absence. It was simply the way things were. But systems that depend on silence must continually adapt, because silence is not static. It erodes. It is tested by time, by curiosity, and by the natural human impulse to understand origins. The first fractures appeared not through exposure, but through inheritance. Property passed down carries with it assumptions about legitimacy. Names carry weight only when their continuity is unquestioned. As generations expanded, as marriages linked families that had not been part of the original design, the architecture of secrecy grew more complex. Every addition increased the risk of inconsistency. Every new witness created a potential leak. To manage this, the daughters developed strategies that mirrored their mothers, though often without conscious acknowledgement. Marriages were encouraged within familiar circles. Outsiders were vetted carefully, not for virtue, but for discretion. Those who asked too many questions were labeled impractical. Those who noticed patterns were reassured with explanations that sounded reasonable enough to close the conversation. Over time, the truth was no longer a single thing being hidden. It became a network of half-truths that reinforced one another. This made it harder to uncover, but also harder to escape. Some descendants felt the weight of this inheritance acutely. They sensed that their position rested on something fragile, something that could not be defended if named. This awareness manifested as rigidity, a heightened concern for order, a moral severity that outwardly emphasized propriety while inwardly suppressing doubt. Others responded differently. They leaned into excess, using indulgence as a way to drown out the discomfort of unexamined privilege. Both responses served the same function. They kept attention away from origins. Years later, long after the widow's name had faded into genealogy rather than memory, an external disruption occurred. Not an accusation, not an investigation, simply a shift in record-keeping. Administrative changes that reorganized archives, consolidated documents, and brought unrelated materials into proximity for the first time. It is often through such bureaucratic accidents that concealed systems are exposed, not because someone was looking for them, but because someone was looking for something else entirely. A clerk noticed discrepancies that did not fit established patterns, dates that are clustered oddly, marginal notes that used unfamiliar symbols, records filed under jurisdictions that did not align with geography. Each irregularity was small enough to ignore. Together, they formed a question. The clerk did not pursue it aggressively. That would have required confidence and support. Instead, the material was set aside, marked for later review. This act of deferral was critical. It preserved the evidence without activating the defenses that would have destroyed it. The families involved sensed the shift almost immediately, not because they were informed, but because they had learned to recognize the subtle signs of attention, requests for clarification, inquiries framed as routine. The past is brushing uncomfortably close to the present. Meetings were held, not formal ones, conversations at dinners, walks taken together under the guise of leisure. The consensus that emerged was cautious. Nothing had been revealed, but the conditions for revelation were forming. The response was containment, not confrontation. The documents would be acknowledged, but contextualized. Any interpretation that suggested intentional design would be dismissed as speculation. The truth, if it surfaced, would be fragmented enough to be deniable. This strategy relied on a fundamental assumption. That truth requires coherence to be believed. That scattered facts without narrative will not threaten established power. For a time, this assumption held. The materials remained obscure. Scholars passed over them in favor of clearer sources. The families relaxed. But the pressure did not disappear. It simply changed form. The descendants who had sensed the secret began to articulate it internally, not as an accusation, but as unease. They asked questions framed as philosophical rather than historical. They explored identity as abstraction. They searched for explanations that did not require confrontation. Some found solace in the idea that all families carry hidden compromises. Others found resentment. A few found courage. Courage, however, does not always lead to exposure. Sometimes it leads to withdrawal. The most dangerous outcome for a concealed system is not scandal, but refusal. Refusal to participate. Refusal to reproduce its logic. When individuals choose not to extend the line, not to marry, and not to pass on the burden, they interrupt the system without ever naming it. These interruptions accumulated quietly. The bloodline persisted, but its momentum slowed. The design began to decay from within, not through revelation, but through exhaustion. By the time the materials resurfaced decades later, in a context that invited scrutiny rather than suppression, the original architects were gone. What remained were descendants faced with a choice they had not made, but now had to own. Whether to maintain the silence out of loyalty to a structure that had benefited them, or to acknowledge that the structure itself was the harm. This choice did not produce a single outcome. Some chose preservation. Others chose disclosure. Most chose something in between, a careful negotiation that allowed them to live with the knowledge without dismantling the world built upon it. The story, when it finally emerged in fragments, did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a complication. A reminder that systems of power often outlast the individuals who create them, and that their consequences ripple forward in ways no design can fully control. The complication did not resolve cleanly, because resolution would have required agreement, and agreement was impossible once the truth existed in multiple forms at once. Some descendants encountered it through documents, others through conversations interrupted before conclusions could be drawn, others through absence itself, through noticing which stories were never told, which names never appeared, and which years collapsed into vague reference. This multiplicity of entry points ensured that the story could not be controlled once it began circulating, but it also ensured that it would never settle into a single authoritative version. That ambiguity protected many people while unsettling all of them. Institutions responded predictably. Archives acknowledged the materials without highlighting them. Catalogs were updated with neutral language. Findings were contextualized as anomalies rather than patterns. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was a professional instinct toward caution, an understanding that certain truths, when framed without care, generate consequences beyond the scope of the evidence itself. The story implicated systems, not just individuals, and systems resist implication. Researchers who encountered the material faced ethical dilemmas. To publish fully was to risk harm to living people who had inherited positions built on deception they had not orchestrated. To suppress was to perpetuate the same silence that had enabled the design in the first place. Many chose compromise. They documented without dramatizing. They analyzed without naming. They preserved without promoting. The result was a body of knowledge that existed but did not circulate widely, knowledge that required intent to access. This is how uncomfortable histories often persist, not erased, but sidelined. Meanwhile, the descendants continued to live with partial awareness. Some confronted it directly, seeking confirmation, demanding access to records, and insisting on clarity. These individuals were often met with resistance, not from institutions, but from family members who feared what clarity would cost. Relationships fractured along these lines. Silence became a point of contention rather than consensus. In some cases, the truth emerged publicly, not as an accusation, but as a personal reckoning. Essays, interviews, statements framed as inheritance rather than exposure. These moments did not dismantle the system, but they altered its emotional landscape. What had once been a source of unspoken certainty became a source of tension. The design had succeeded materially, but failed psychologically. The cost of that failure was carried unevenly. Those who chose disclosure often found themselves isolated, accused of betrayal, or dismissed as opportunistic. Those who chose silence retained their positions, but at the expense of internal coherence. They knew something they could not integrate without contradiction. Over time, this contradiction manifested in subtle ways. Anxieties around legitimacy, overinvestment in lineage, a defensive posture toward challenges to social order. The system had trained its inheritors to fear disruption, and fear became its legacy. Beyond the families, the broader cultural implications remained largely unexamined. The story challenged foundational assumptions about identity, inheritance, and purity that many preferred to treat as settled. It revealed how categories enforced as natural had been manipulated when expedient. It demonstrated that power adapts its own rules when survival is at stake. These implications were too destabilizing to be absorbed easily. They required a willingness to see history not as a sequence of moral binaries, but as a series of negotiations conducted under pressure, often at the expense of the vulnerable. The man at the center of it all remained largely absent from these discussions. His voice had been taken. His records were minimal. His existence persisted primarily through the impact he had on others, rather than through any preserved account of his own experience. This absence is itself instructive. It illustrates how systems of exploitation erase subjectivity while extracting value. He became a function, then a problem, then a ghost. Even in exposure, he was often referenced abstractly, as evidence rather than as a person. This is another cost of delayed truth. When justice is postponed long enough, even remembrance becomes compromised. The design of the bloodline achieved its immediate goals. It secured property. It stabilized inheritance. It preserved status. But it also generated a long-term instability that no amount of silence could fully contain. Each generation inherited not just assets, but an unresolved moral debt. Some paid it through withdrawal, others through denial. A few attempted restitution through acknowledgement, though acknowledgement alone could not rebalance what had been taken. The widow's design outlived her by generations, but it did not outlast scrutiny. It was never dismantled completely, but it was rendered visible enough to lose its illusion of inevitability. And once inevitability is gone, power must justify itself anew. That is the quiet after effect of such stories. They do not overturn systems overnight. They alter the terms under which those systems are understood. They introduce doubt where certainty once stood. They remind us that history is not only what happened, but also what was allowed to be remembered. Visibility changed the nature of the inheritance. What had once been carried silently now had edges and contours that could be examined even if they were not fully acknowledged. This altered how subsequent generations related to the past. Some approached it cautiously, treating the material as a warning rather than a legacy. Others resisted, arguing that exposure served no constructive purpose and that history, however uncomfortable, should not be retroactively moralized. This debate did not produce resolution, but it did produce engagement, and engagement itself marked a departure from the original design. The widow system depended on disengagement, on people accepting outcomes without interrogating origins. Once interrogation became possible, even privately, the system could no longer function as intended. It had to adapt to scrutiny, and adaptation introduced vulnerability. The institutions that had once shielded the story began to fracture under generational turnover. Archivists retired. Policies changed. Access widened incrementally. What had required personal permission now required only persistence. This shift did not lead to immediate revelation, but it changed the balance of power between concealment and discovery. The truth no longer depended solely on the goodwill of gatekeepers. It could be assembled by those willing to follow trails across disparate collections to connect references that had once been safely isolated. This kind of reconstruction is slow, but it is also resilient. Once enough fragments are public, suppression becomes less effective. The descendants who engaged with this process often described it not as liberation, but as disorientation. Their identities had been built on narratives that now felt provisional. The past was no longer a stable foundation, but a contested space requiring negotiation. This disorientation sometimes manifested as anger directed outward, toward institutions or historians perceived as intruders. Other times it turned inward, producing shame or confusion that could not easily be resolved. These responses were shaped by proximity. Those who benefited most from the original design often struggled most with its implications. Those further removed found it easier to acknowledge, though not necessarily to act. The story's broader circulation coincided with cultural shifts that made its themes harder to dismiss. Conversations about identity, power, and historical accountability created a context in which previously sidelined narratives gained traction. The design of the bloodline was no longer an isolated curiosity. It became an example of how systems adapt to protect themselves, even when doing so requires violating the principles they publicly uphold. This reframing did not require sensationalism. It emerged naturally from the accumulation of evidence and its resonance with contemporary questions. The widow's actions were no longer interpreted solely as individual transgression, but as a manifestation of structural incentives. She had not invented the logic she followed. She had exploited it with unusual precision. This distinction mattered. It shifted focus away from moral exceptionalism toward systemic critique. The man at the center of the design began to reappear in these discussions, though still imperfectly. Scholars attempted to reconstruct his life through indirect means, reading between the lines of documents not written for his benefit. These reconstructions were necessarily speculative, but they served an important function. They reintroduced subjectivity where it had been stripped away. They insisted that the story was not only about outcomes, but also about experience. That insistence challenged the original premise of the design, which treated human life as interchangeable input. The descendants' responses to this reframing varied. Some welcomed it as a corrective. Others resisted, arguing that speculation risked distortion. Both positions revealed a deeper discomfort. Acknowledging the man as a person required acknowledging that the benefits inherited had been extracted from a life constrained beyond repair. That acknowledgement threatened the moral neutrality many preferred to maintain. Over time, the story settled into a pattern familiar to other suppressed histories. It became known in certain circles, referenced cautiously, debated academically, largely absent from popular narratives. This partial visibility was itself a legacy of the original design. Full exposure would have required a reckoning too disruptive for many institutions to embrace. Partial exposure allowed the story to exist without forcing resolution. It remained an open question rather than a closed chapter. The widow's design had been built to last, but it had not been built to be understood. Understanding introduces accountability, and accountability destabilizes systems that rely on asymmetry. Even incomplete understanding alters behavior. It influences how people talk about inheritance, about legitimacy, and about the past. It creates space for doubt, and doubt is the beginning of change. The bloodline persisted. Names continued. Properties changed hands. But the certainty that had once surrounded these continuities was gone. In its place was an awareness, sometimes explicit, sometimes not, that the past was not as clean as it appeared. That awareness did not undo the design, but it prevented its repetition in the same form. Systems learn from exposure, even when they resist condemnation. The story's final significance lies not in scandal or revelation, but in this subtle shift. It demonstrates how power can be challenged not only through confrontation, but also through sustained attention. Through the refusal to forget, through the willingness to sit with complexity rather than resolve it prematurely. The widow had believed that control of information ensured control of outcomes. She was correct in the short term. In the long term, information proved more durable than she anticipated. It waited. The waiting was not passive. Information does not simply endure. It exerts pressure over time. As more fragments entered circulation, even without cohesion, they began to influence how related histories were interpreted. Researchers revisiting adjacent topics encountered anomalies they could no longer dismiss as isolated, patterns repeated. Similar arrangements were hinted at elsewhere, though never documented as thoroughly. The realization emerged gradually that the design had not been unique in concept, only in preservation. This realization did not broaden acceptance, it deepened discomfort. If the design was not singular, then the questions it raised were not confined to one lineage or one place. They extended outward, implicating a wider landscape of incentives and accommodations that had been normalized under different names. Institutions reacted by narrowing scope. Studies emphasized specificity. Caveats multiplied. The story was framed as exceptional precisely to avoid its generalization. Exceptional stories can be absorbed without requiring structural change. Representative stories cannot. This distinction shaped how the material was taught, cited, and archived. It remained available but carefully bounded. Meanwhile, individuals outside academic contexts encountered the story obliquely, through local memory, through family anecdotes that did not align, through sudden recognition when names, dates, and places intersected in unexpected ways. For these individuals, discovery was often personal before it was intellectual. It arrived as a question about self rather than a theory about history. This difference mattered. Personal discovery bypasses institutional mediation. It demands response rather than analysis. Some sought confirmation. Others avoided it. Avoidance became another inheritance, passed down, not through instruction, but through emotional cues. The discomfort around certain topics. The abrupt change in tone when lineage was discussed. The insistence that some curiosities were better left unexplored. These cues shaped behavior as effectively as any explicit rule. Over time, however, avoidance proved unsustainable. The cultural context shifted again. Technologies made access easier. Digitization collapsed distances between archives. What once required physical presence and permission could now be assembled remotely. The balance tipped further, not toward total exposure, but toward inevitability. Once information can be duplicated and shared, control becomes a matter of influence rather than possession. Those who had relied on obscurity found themselves negotiating instead. Negotiation altered the moral frame. Silence could no longer be justified as protection. It had to be defended as preference. This defense was weaker. It invited challenge. Some families responded by commissioning their own histories, attempting to contextualize the design within broader narratives of survival and constraint. These accounts emphasized circumstance. They acknowledged harm without conceding intent. They sought absolution through complexity. Others refused engagement entirely, trusting that time would erode interest. Both strategies reflected the same fear. That acknowledgement would not stop at recognition, but would demand reckoning. Reckoning implies responsibility, and responsibility implies change. Change threatens continuity, which had been the design's original purpose. The man's absence remained a central tension. Efforts to center his experience often stalled at the limits of evidence. Without direct testimony, his life was reconstructed through inference. Inference invites debate. Debate delays consensus. This delay served those invested in ambiguity. Yet even without consensus, the attempt itself mattered. It marked a refusal to let the story remain purely abstract. It insisted on the presence of a person where the design had allowed only function. This insistence reshaped the ethical landscape. It challenged readers and listeners to consider not only what was achieved, but also what was taken. The story's endurance owed much to this shift. It became less about lineage and more about method. Less about guilt and more about governance. How systems decide whose lives are flexible, how rules bend when outcomes are threatened, how silence is maintained through distributed responsibility. These questions resonated beyond the original context. They found echoes in other histories, other arrangements that relied on the same logic even when the details differed. In this way, the design's exposure contributed to a broader vocabulary for discussing power without resorting to spectacle. The emotional tone of these discussions remained restrained. There were no definitive villains to condemn without implicating entire structures. There were no clean resolutions to offer. This restraint preserved credibility. It allowed the story to persist without being dismissed as polemic. It invited sustained engagement rather than momentary outrage. That invitation was the most subversive outcome. It encouraged people to sit with discomfort long enough to recognize patterns in places they had not expected. As the story settled into this role, it lost the sharpness of revelation and gained the weight of reference. It became something others pointed to when discussing hidden architectures of inheritance. It was no longer a secret, but it was not yet a lesson universally accepted. It occupied a liminal space, neither buried nor resolved. That space is where many difficult histories remain, not because they lack evidence, but because they challenge frameworks that are still operational. The widow's design had depended on control of narrative. Its afterlife depended on the erosion of that control. Erosion is slow. It does not announce victory, but it alters the terrain, and altered terrain changes what can be built next. What followed was not closure, but accommodation. Once a story reaches a certain threshold of awareness, it no longer needs to be actively suppressed to be managed. It can be absorbed, reframed, and redistributed in ways that preserve existing hierarchies while acknowledging complexity. This is how many uncomfortable histories survive without transforming the structures that produce them. The design was now discussed, but more often as a cautionary tale rather than a living inheritance. Its implications were acknowledged in theory while remaining distant in practice. This distance allowed people to engage intellectually without confronting the material consequences that continued to shape their lives. Some descendants attempted to convert awareness into ethical positioning. They aligned themselves with causes that emphasized justice and reform, not always recognizing that this alignment functioned as both response and insulation. Advocacy became a way to distance oneself from the specifics of the past without interrogating the benefits it had conferred. Others reacted by retreating into privacy, treating the story as a family matter rather than a historical one. This privatization mirrored the original containment strategy, though without the same degree of coordination. It relied on the assumption that personal discomfort justified discretion. That assumption was rarely challenged directly, but it was increasingly questioned indirectly as norms around transparency shifted. Younger generations, less invested in inherited reputations, approached the material differently. They were less inclined to protect names and more inclined to understand mechanisms. For them, the story was not about betrayal or loyalty. It was about structure, about how incentives shape behavior, about how morality is negotiated when survival and advantage are at stake. This analytical distance did not diminish emotional impact. It reframed it. Anger was less common than disillusionment. The realization that systems could be so carefully engineered and so widely accepted produced a kind of quiet reckoning. It forced reconsideration of what legitimacy meant and who had the authority to define it. The institutions that mediated these discussions continued to exercise restraint. Conferences framed the topic narrowly. Publications emphasized methodology. This caution was often justified as professionalism, but it also functioned as risk management. The story's implications extended beyond a single case. They raised questions about archival authority, about whose histories are preserved and whose are fragmented. Engaging fully with those questions would have required institutional self-examination. Few were eager to pursue that path. As a result, the story remained a reference point rather than a catalyst. Yet even as a reference point, it exerted influence. It appeared in footnotes, in lectures, in conversations that began elsewhere and drifted toward it as an example of how power operates quietly. This diffusion ensured that the design could not be fully reburied. It also ensured that it would not dominate discourse. It became one thread among many, woven into a larger tapestry of contested history. The man whose life had been central to the design remained difficult to place within this evolving narrative. Efforts to center him risked collapsing the story into moral absolutism, which some feared would obscure structural analysis. Efforts to treat him abstractly risked repeating the erasure that had defined his experience. This tension persisted, unresolved. It reflected a broader challenge in historical storytelling: how to honor individual suffering without reducing systemic critique to anecdote. The absence of his voice continued to shape interpretation. It reminded audiences that some losses cannot be recovered, only acknowledged. Over time, the design's significance shifted again. It was no longer primarily about lineage. It became about precedent, about how far systems will go to preserve themselves, and how those actions reverberate long after the immediate threat has passed. This reframing allowed the story to travel. It was cited in discussions of governance, of ethics, and of institutional memory. It lost some specificity in the process, but gained applicability. This trade-off was not accidental. It reflected the way histories are adapted to serve present needs. As long as the story remained unresolved, it could be used to illustrate complexity without demanding resolution. That unresolved state was both its limitation and its power. It resisted closure because closure would have required consensus on responsibility, and consensus was impossible without confronting ongoing inequities. The widow's design had achieved continuity through control. Its afterlife achieved endurance through ambiguity. Both relied on the same principle, that uncertainty can be as stabilizing as certainty if managed correctly. Yet ambiguity is not neutral. It favors those already positioned to absorb its costs. Those without such buffers experience it as disorientation. This disparity became more visible as conversations around history and identity intensified. The story was no longer just about what had happened, but about who had the capacity to live comfortably with its consequences. That question lingered, unanswered, shaping how the narrative was received and who felt implicated by it. What remains after the documents have been read, after the testimonies have been compared, and after the patterns have been acknowledged, is not a conclusion, but a residue. The kind that does not announce itself, but persists quietly, shaping how institutions behave and how people understand their place within them. The design did not end when it was exposed. It ended when it became unnecessary to enforce it actively, when its outcomes had been sufficiently distributed to ensure continuity without oversight. That is how systems mature. They shed their most visible mechanisms and retain only the effects. By the time recognition arrived, the conditions it had produced were already normalized. This normalization is what makes retrospective judgment feel both necessary and insufficient. Necessary, because without it, the story collapses into abstraction. Insufficient, because judgment alone does not alter the structures that benefited from the design's success. The archive can document intent, but it cannot redistribute consequence. That work belongs to the present, and the present is rarely prepared to accept it fully. In this case, the present was negotiated instead. It allowed acknowledgement without disruption. It permitted discussion without restitution. It framed understanding as an end in itself. This framing was persuasive because it appeared ethical. It suggested that recognition could substitute for repair. For some, that was enough. For others, it was a reminder that history does not resolve itself simply by being told. The widow's choices were once constrained by debt, by expectation, and by the limited options available within her social order. Those constraints were real, but they were also leveraged. She did not merely endure them, she exploited them. That distinction matters, not because it condemns her uniquely, but because it illustrates how agency operates under pressure. Pressure does not eliminate choice, it reshapes it. The most enduring designs are those that convert necessity into justification. That conversion allows individuals to perceive their actions as inevitable rather than intentional. Over time, inevitability becomes tradition, and tradition becomes invisible. The people who inherited the outcomes of the design did not choose its origin, but they benefited from its endurance. That benefit was unevenly distributed, and so was awareness of its source. Some lived with partial knowledge, others lived with none. A few carried fragments they did not know how to assemble. This unevenness ensured that reckoning would be fragmented as well. No single response could encompass the full range of positions created by the design. Attempts to do so often collapsed under their own generality. The story resisted simplification because the system that produced it had been designed to do exactly that, to diffuse responsibility while consolidating advantage. Even now, its legacy can be observed in subtler forms, in how institutions prioritize continuity over accountability, in how narratives are curated to emphasize resilience while minimizing extraction, in how moral complexity is invoked to delay action rather than inform it. These are not coincidences, they are echoes. The design's most effective feature was not secrecy, it was plausible. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each step could be defended as practical, even prudent. Only when viewed collectively did the pattern emerge. That is how systemic harm often operates, not through singular transgression, but through accumulation. The archive captures accumulation imperfectly. It preserves moments, not momentum. To understand the full impact of the design requires attending to what the archive cannot show, the ways in which altered trajectories compound over time. Lives redirected, opportunities foreclosed, advantages entrenched. These are not easily quantified, but they are no less real. The absence of formal reckoning does not mean the absence of consequence. It means that consequence has been displaced. It appears elsewhere, often in places least equipped to absorb it. The story's endurance challenges the assumption that exposure leads to resolution. Exposure is a beginning, not an end. It reveals contours, not outcomes. What follows depends on willingness, not knowledge. And willingness is shaped by interest. Those most positioned to act are often least inclined to do so, precisely because action would disrupt the stability they inherited. This is not unique to this case. It is a recurring feature of historical reckoning. The widow's design succeeded because it aligned moral compromise with material security. Its afterlife persists because that alignment remains intact in different forms. The question, then, is not whether the past should be judged by present standards. It is whether the present is willing to be judged by the standards it claims to uphold. That question remains open. The story does not offer answers. It offers a framework, one that asks how systems transform constraint into opportunity, how silence functions as strategy, and how legitimacy is manufactured and maintained. These questions are not confined to history. They recur wherever power is exercised without transparency and advantage is preserved without scrutiny. The archive does not demand a particular response. It demands attention. It insists that the past is not inert. It is active, shaping choices long after its originators are gone. The design's final lesson is not about a single individual or a singular act. It is about how easily necessity becomes narrative and how narratives, once accepted, can outlive the conditions that produce them. To bear witness to that process is to recognize that history is not behind us. It is embedded in the present, informing decisions that appear neutral but are anything but. The obligation, then, is not to remember for remembrance's sake, but to interrogate continuity, to ask what has been inherited, and at what cost, to consider not only what was designed, but also what continues to function because it was designed well. That consideration is uncomfortable. It resists closure. But discomfort is not an argument against engagement. It is evidence that engagement is necessary. The story ends where it began, not with resolution, but with documentation, with the recognition that some designs are never fully dismantled. They are simply absorbed, normalized, and forgotten, until someone looks closely enough to see the seams. If you believe these buried histories matter, if you think understanding how systems are built is essential to understanding how they still operate, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue examining the records that were never meant to be heard this closely.